intersect the intellectual, spiritual, and historical contribution of women. To begin our program, we would like to inform you that, due to an unexpected emergency, our chair of KADEM, Attorney Dr. Canan Sarı, will not be able to join us today. In her place, the Deputy of Manager of KADEM, Dr. Betül Özel Çiçek, will deliver the opening speech.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, dear friends, good morning and welcome to Istanbul. Welcome to you all. On behalf of the Women and Democracy Association KADEM, and in place of our esteemed chair, Dr. Canan Sarı, who is currently on pilgrimage, I extend her warmest greetings and heartfelt prayers. She asked me to convey her deep gratitude for you, for your presence, and her sincere wishes for the success of this meaningful gathering. Hopefully, she will be with us at the last dinner of our workshop. It's also an exceptional honor for me to offer these welcoming remarks. Deputy Manager for Strategic Planning at KADEM, overseeing our advocacy, research, international partnerships, and projects. The unit that organized this event, Advocacy and Research Unit, aims to bridge scholarly inquiry with strategic action. We produce research that informs public policy, but we also remain deeply attentive to questions of meaning, ethics, metaphysics that shape humans' lives. As many of you might know, KADEM is a civil society organization based in Turkey, dedicated to strengthening women's roles in society through legal advocacy, educational programs, and evidence-based policy work. Our vision is rooted in the pursuit of justice, dignity, and equality for sustainable wholeness of the society. These values, we believe, are deeply resonant with Sufism. That is why, when we have launched the international workshop series, we began this journey with the theme of Women and Sufism. We believe that Sufism offers a deeply ontological and ethical model that can guide contemporary discussions on gender, community, and human subjecthood. While global discourses on gender often remain trapped with rigid hegemonic binaries or reactive paradigms, the Sufi path gestures towards something more expansive. It invites us to contemplate what is considered as agency and as power. In a world saturated with noise, so much noise and so much conflict, Sufism proposes a standstill moment of contemplation, tefekkür, and sukut. In a world obsessed with control, it offers fena, a surrender that refines the self in the mirror of the divine. As Aziz Mahmud Hüdayi, a 16th century Sufi saint of Istanbul, reminds us, tevhid ile olur her derde derman, hakka tevhid ile ermiş erenler. In unity lies the cure for every sorrow. Those who have reached the truth have done so through unity. And as we speak of tawhid, we must reckon its moral command and demand. We cannot speak of divine unity without acknowledging the current situation of our world. And we cannot invoke unity without first grieving its division. As we gather here in the spirit of Sufi compassion, we cannot remain silent in the face of ongoing genocide in Gaza. The genocide in Gaza is a wound in the very body of our shared humanity. The genocide reminds us that tawhid is a moral imperative. At KADEM, our work is grounded in the belief that every human being reflects a divine secret. As Shaikh Galip, one of the most original poets of the late 18th century Ottoman world, and a prominent figure within the Mevlevi Sufi order in Istanbul reminds us. Hoşça bak zatına kim, zübde-i alemsin sen. Merdum-i dide-i ekvanı olan alemsin sen. Gaze gently upon yourself. You are the essence of the world. O human, you are the pupil of the universe's eyes. This is not simply poetic or even anthropocentric, as some might assume. It's a call to recognize human dignity as ontological. This is an important fact we shouldn't forget, especially as we, with bleeding hearts, witness the atrocities unfolding in Gaza now. Dear friends, we are especially proud that this event gathers voices from across the globe, from Cape Town to Amsterdam, from Istanbul to Birmingham, from Germany to Australia, bringing together diverse traditions, disciplines, and lineages of thought. Scholars here today do not merely represent academic excellence. They also carry intellectual inheritances that are both rooted and restless. Turkey, especially Istanbul, is especially a meaningful place for this conversation for us. Istanbul, we believe, is a living archive of Sufi thought and feeling. From Sheikh Galip to Aziz Mahmud Hüdayi, this city carries the breath of those who lived through the veils of form to the heart of meaning. Here, Sufism is not confined to archives or museums. It breathes in the air we speak, the poetry we recite, the architecture we live in. It is, in a very real sense, infused in our everyday life. And yet, we must not and do not romanticize. Part of our task is to engage this heritage critically, to unearth its silences as well as its illuminations, and to reanimate its truths for the present. In that manner, this workshop is not designed to reach easy conclusions, but to hold space for difficult questions. What does it mean to be a seeker who is also a woman? Can mystical experience transcend the structures of gender without denying the body's histories? How might Sufi ethics illuminate feminist struggles without being subsumed by them? And in closing, I want to thank you all, our partners and participants. We are honored to partner with Lancaster University in convening this unique workshop. We view this partnership as both an academic endeavor and a part of a larger vision that honors tradition while creating space for reflective renewal and inclusive belonging. And I want to extend my special thanks to Dr. Shuruq Naguib. We are deeply grateful for her vision and collaboration. And as a personal note, from the very first moment I met Shuruq Hocam, I felt the rare pleasure of conversing in a shared language, a language of thought and spirit. And to each speaker, to each of you, thank you for accepting our invitation and bringing your insight, care, and critical imaginations. And to everyone joining us, whether as scholar, seeker, student, or all, I hope this weekend nourishes you in intellect and in spirit. And I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Ravza Altuntaş, a dedicated member of our academic committee and one of our advisors at the Advocacy and Research Unit, whose efforts have been indispensable in shaping this workshop. And my heartfelt thanks also go to Zulal, who has worked tirelessly over the past weeks with remarkable dedication, and to the entire KADEM team, whose commitment and care make gatherings like this possible. May this workshop sow the seeds of deeper inquiry, lasting friendships, and a renewed ethical imagination. We look forward to learning from you. Welcome, hoş geldiniz.
We thank Dr. Özel Çiçek for her thoughtful remarks. I now invite Dr. Shuruq Naguib from Lancaster University to the stage for the second opening address.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين It's such an honor to follow Betül Hocam's soul-felt, heart-reasoned speech, a speech from the Fuad. I have been given the honor by my colleagues at KADEM to offer the opening remarks for our Women and Sufism workshop. I will start where my dear friend, Dr. Betül, or Betül Hocam, as we say here in Turkey, concluded by reiterating her thanks and adding a few of my own. Thank you all for joining us in this public session as we embark together on a journey of learning and reflection. Sincere thanks also go to all the speakers and moderators who will be sharing their expertise, and to each participant here today, whether in person or attending online. It is your presence today and tomorrow that will transform this event into a vibrant community of inquiry into women and Sufism. I would also like to warmly thank the KADEM organizers and sponsors whose hard work, generosity, and pioneering vision have made this gathering possible, especially Dr. Betül and Dr. Ravza Altuntash, for their generous exchange of knowledge, selfless dedication to improving women's lives, and unconditional friendship. I have already said this last night, but I say it for those who joined us today. You will not be surprised to learn that the idea of this workshop was fittingly consolidated during joyful and enriching conversations on a visit to Konya, on the blessed Shabirus of Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi, the world-famous Sufi poet. I would also like to thank the KADEM research and advocacy team, especially Özel, for her incredible logistical organization, as you will all agree with me, and the many others who helped bring this vision to life. I would like to acknowledge the support of the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Lancaster University, and the School of Global Affairs, where my discipline, Religious Studies, is now located. At Lancaster, we embrace a glocal vision. This means that while we engage with broad global issues, we remain deeply rooted in communities and lived realities. The global lens we adopt is not simply a narrative about Western universality and its others. Rather, it reflects a genuine commitment across the school and faculty to developing a decolonial horizon of knowledge, one that values pluriversality and ways of knowing, and centers the lived traditions of all communities. This workshop exemplifies those values by highlighting the importance of women and Sufism as an inquiry, and by ensuring that women's voices, whether historical or contemporary, practitioner or academic, are heard and celebrated, not in a provincialized or narrowly framed way, but as voices that speak to the richness of the Islamic tradition, to both the richness of the Islamic tradition and to our shared, truly global understanding. Our work here in this workshop, in part, is an effort to reconstruct from often fragmented and diverse sources the roles that women have played within Sufism from its inception. This is an underdeveloped, understudied area within scholarship on Tasawwuf. A prime example of this is the 8th century mystic Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, who is remembered for transforming the very notion of divine love into a selfless devotion to God, transcending utilitarian or legalistic frameworks. Yet within mainstream scholarship on Sufism, women remain what Rukhsar Hussain aptly terms the missing narrative. Building on the work of pioneers such as Margaret Smith and Marie Chemel, and more recently Asma Saeed, our workshop not only foregrounds women and Sufism as an important field of inquiry, but centers women and gender at the heart of the inquiry into Sufism itself. We explore women's intellectual, social, spiritual, and literary roles within that tradition, including both as poets and as metaphors within the Sufi imaginary. In doing so, we not only deepen our understanding of Sufism, but also contribute to a more inclusive and holistic vision of the Islamic tradition and more broadly of global history and culture. This means that any recovery of the missing narrative must proceed with full awareness of how modern scholarship on Sufism, from its earliest formation, contributed to much of the silencing we are now seeking to address. We should also recall that the Islamic archive, broadly defined, for example, though not exclusively, the rich bibliographical and biographical works, preserves the names and legacies of hundreds of women scholars and Sufis. As Ruth Woddard and others have shown, the absence of women from many modern narratives about Islam and Sufism is not simply the result of a historical muting of their presence, but of how their presence has been selectively transmitted, framed, and read within contemporary scholarship. We must hold space, therefore, as Betül Hojjam put it, for centering other epistemes, voices, and narratives, including those of women whose contributions to Sufi thought and practice, past and present, we seek to illuminate over the next 2 days. But holding space demands that we ask which narratives are missing, where are they missing, for example, in general introductions to Sufism, such as niches, or in landmark works like Shahab Ahmad's What is Islam? Why are they missing? And how can we recover them? The point is we should not just reproduce dominant presuppositions about past or present. Throughout this workshop, we will explore a rich tapestry of topics that reflect and attempt to answer some of these questions. Our discussions will range from questions of ethical engagement to explorations of female spirituality, both past and present, and we will hear from scholars applying feminist hermeneutics to sacred texts and Sufi teachings, offering new insights into justice, authority, and gender within the tradition. Crucially, our program brings together both historical and contemporary case studies. We will examine figures such as the remarkable 16th century Sufi master, such as a remarkable 16th century female Sufi master from Central Asia, who's recognized for her leadership and wide-reaching spiritual authority, and a present-day woman Shaikh in Turkey, whose inclusive order comprising both women and men challenges conventional gender norms in Sufi practice. We will also revisit the legacies of inspirational early Muslim women, such as Khadija and Aisha, whose spiritual lives continue to serve as exemplars. From medieval poetry to modern ethnography, and from the Persian art world to contemporary global Sufi communities, the workshop invites us to think across temporal, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries. The breadth of our subject matter is matched by the diversity of our participants. We are honored to have scholars, participants, and attendees joining us from across different countries, cultures, and academic disciplines. This diversity, I believe, will enable us to engender an inclusive, critical, and creative academic dialogue, or should I say, globalogue. We encourage everyone here to engage actively, critically, and creatively, to ask questions, to share insights, and to challenge respectfully. As organizers, we uphold the true spirit of scholarship and the ethical spirit of love and friendship, a spirit quintessential to Sufism itself. This ethos, which emphasizes humility, as well as listening and oneness in diversity, will serve as our collective code of conduct, our ahd, as some of the Sufis say throughout this workshop. One final note, the subject matter of our conference, Women and Sufism, holds profound ethical significance, perhaps more now more than ever. And just echoing Betül Hojjam, in the face of persistent global injustices and the mindless degradation of humanity in Gaza, and confronting more conflicts in the future, we must traverse into a tradition that turns on the possibility of human perfection through an inner journey of love, devotion, and ethical transformation. The conversations we will begin here will inspire further research, collaboration, and networking, I hope. But I also hope that they will inspire personal transformation and greater commitment to dignifying humanity. Let us remember that we are not merely inquiring. We are also, in a sense, making history by developing, reframing, and foregrounding the importance of women and Sufism as a field of inquiry. This brings me back to our keynote. We are especially honored to have Professor Sadia Sheikh here with us, a leading scholar of Islam, gender, and Sufism, whose pioneering work has inspired many of us. And on a personal note, I have had the privilege of teaching her work in my Philosophy 101 Islam section. And it has been immensely enriching for me and my students, and I know we all stand to learn a great deal from her insights, as well as from our esteemed speakers and panelists. Once again, on behalf of the organizing committee, welcome to the Women and Sufism workshop, the inaugural event of KADEM's international workshops on women and the sacred. Thank you very much.
We thank Dr. Naguib for her insightful words. We will now begin our keynote session. The lecture is titled Flourishing Feminist Friendships, Engaged in Contemporary Sufi Ethics, delivered by Professor Dr. Shaikh from the University of Cape Town. The session will be moderated by Dr. Betül Özel Çiçek, Deputy General Manager at KADEM. After presentation will be Q&A session. Here.
Okay, Esther, Bismillah. It's both a professional honor and a personal pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Shaikh. Professor Shaikh is a global, as you all know, renowned scholar whose work lies at the intersection of Sufism, gender ethics, and Islamic feminism. She is a professor in the study of religions at the University of Cape Town and the director of the Center for Contemporary Islam. Her intellectual journey exemplifies the profound integration of spirituality and social justice, where the mystical meets the political and the ethical meets the embodied. Among her seminal works are Sufi Narratives of Intimacy, Ibn Arabi, Gender and Sexuality, and the Women's Hutbah book, both of which have shaped contemporary conversations on religion, power, and gender. Her contributions extend beyond the academy into active spaces, where she actively promotes gender justice within Islamic thought and practice. And in today's keynote, titled Flourishing Feminist Friendships, Engaging Contemporary Sufi Ethics, Professor Shaikh invites us to reflect on the concept of friendship grounded in the Sufi idea, welaye, that can serve as a feminist ethical modality. She proposes a radical yet faithful engagement with tradition, one that resists authoritarianism while honoring spiritual relationships. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sadi, Dr. Sadi.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Betül. Thank you very much, Shuruq. And thank you to the wonderful KADEM team of young women who are just so inspiring and welcoming. Alhamdulillah, it's truly a barakah to be here in your presence, and I am genuinely excited about this workshop. Bismillah, I would like to begin my talk with 2 Quranic verses, and I'll begin by reciting one of them. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. المؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة ويطيعون الله ورسوله أولئك سيرحمهم الله إن الله عزيز حكيم صدق الله العظيم ألا إن أولياء الله لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون صدق الله العظيم So these two beautiful Quranic verses that translate into the first one from Surah At-Tawbah, the believers, men and women, are awliya, friends, protecting friends of one another. They enjoin the doing of what is right, al-ma'ruf, and forbid the doing of what is wrong, al-munkar, and are constant in their prayers and render the purifying alms and pay heed unto God and God's apostle. God bestows grace upon them. Indeed, Allah is mighty and wise. And then the second verse is from Surah Yunus. Surely on the friends of Allah, the awliya, there is no fear, and nor shall they grieve. And in this time where the world seems completely consumed by grief, in the times of genocide and in the times of attacks and brutality on the world stage, we cling on desperately to the truth of Allah being the friends of those who are faithful. May Allah contain our fear and our grief in this time, and may there be a triumph over all tyrants and oppressors everywhere, inshallah. So, beloveds, I am inspired by these Quranic verses on friendship. Friendship between men and women, friendship between human beings, and friendship with Allah. And so in this paper, I am going to present some of my current research project on Muslim feminist ethics. In particular, I would like to outline the three parts of my paper. I'm going to begin by to make sure that we're all on the same page, or at least to put you on my page, and you can decide to agree or disagree with that page. So to put some of that contextualizations, and then to posit and to present my own theorization of Islamic feminism as a friendship within tradition. And I do this as a kind of working with, relationship with, playing with the idea of walaya, this very kind of deeply animating mode of Sufi relationality and pedagogy. And then I will kind of do the last bit of my paper is a reflection on current Sheikha-Murid relationships and to think about what accountability and leadership might look like. So, Bismillah. So contemporary Muslim subjectivities and ethical concerns are informed by varied sources, and often this includes a relationship to Islamic intellectual traditions as well as other traditions of virtue and social justice. Muslim ways of being and becoming are derived from cosmopolitan imaginaries, and this is in fact no different from other significant eras of Muslim history. Islamic feminism represents one such contemporary development, and it is focused on fostering ever more comprehensive forms of gender and social justice. Now, an older debate, and I'm hoping that most people, I'm just kind of clearing the weeds, but I'm hoping that this is something that need not be said in this context, but let's say it in any case. So the older debate of Islam and feminism has been mutually exclusive, and Islamic feminism, in many, particularly Western audiences, I've heard this question, oh, isn't Islamic feminism a contradiction in terms? So opponents to Islamic feminism, whether these are anti-religious feminists, highly secular feminists, Islamophobes, or patriarchal Muslim men, are strange allies who, despite very different political locations, all claim that narratives of gender justice are the primary and exclusive property of a secular West and are simply adopted by other groupings instrumentally. These are deeply problematic positionings, and they're premised on a dualistic binary. And firstly, here's some problems with this binary. It ignores a rich and robust legacy of Muslim gender debates and contestations within the long arch of the tradition. Secondly, it posits an inaccurate secularist binary of religious life and social context as two distinct spheres, as if religiosity exists in a realm separate from broader social life and intellectual milieu. And thirdly, it assumes that people are primarily formed by singular discourses. That is, that there must always be a tension between being Muslim and seeking gender justice. So these fallacies are that ideas on gender justice must always come from somewhere outside of where Islam exists, and that it belongs essentially to the sphere of the secular. And these formulations are not just inaccurate and misrepresentative, they also run contrary to the self-definitions of many Muslim feminists who present their work as a development, a refinement, and an application of their faith imperatives, even as we might be in conversation and informed by various other currents of post-colonial and decolonial feminist thought. So, what is Islamic feminism? Broadly speaking, it's a knowledge project, it's a world-making project. There are three primary kind of components of Islamic feminism that I have on the PowerPoint. On the one hand, and these are kind of shared aspects or components of any feminist work, it is a consciousness and a critique of sexism, patriarchy, androcentrism in all of its forms, firstly, so it's that awareness, that critical awareness, and secondly, doing the transformative intellectual and political work of transforming those sexist structures in a society with the goal and the vision of freedom, justice, and equality. And so this is a kind of shared, most feminist projects have the idea of consciousness critique, the idea of transformational work, and the idea of a vision of justice and freedom. What makes Islamic feminism, I would argue, distinctive is that this vision, this third part of it, is grounded in a foundational God-human relationship that roots the processes and the goals of individual and communal life. So justice, freedom, and equality, I argue, are always situated in a broader framework of understanding reality. So there's a cosmology to be thinking about justice and freedom. And Islamic feminism is deeply rooted by, animated by, inspired by, and develops this cosmology of what it means to be located in a foundational God-human relationship that is not just individual, but that has collective and social implications. And so at this point, I just want to also clarify one or two other things that we actually need to recognize upfront. That, we know in this room, we know, and hopefully in most places, there's a clear recognition that there are no monolithic Muslim women. There are diverse experiences and relationships to Islam, and a whole range of possibilities, from religiously conservative women to secular women to women who affiliate with Islamic political parties to Muslim feminists, and a number of who across these very different political locations still are invested in gender justice. And of course, some women that are not invested in gender justice. This is the whole ambit of Muslim women's realities. And the other part that's really imperative for us to recognize is that believers experience in Islam in complex and sometimes even in ambivalent ways. Women and men may experience at once and simultaneously affirming and diminishing elements within their experience of religion. There are central religious imperatives that are profoundly humanizing and that provide some of us with fundamental narratives of meaning, of value, of existence to believers. And in some contexts, also, there are types of liberation and feminist theology that has served, that the belonging within religion has really served to critically animate liberation consciousness. Particularly in my context of South Africa, Islam really served as a way to animate how we thought about anti-racist kind of formations and political formations. So this idea of religion as being a source of thinking critically around injustice is a voice that many Muslim women have echoed with, in broad senses, not just around gender, but around social justice more broadly. Simultaneously, we have to recognize that Muslims encounter understandings and expressions within their everyday lives of Islam or of people that speak in the name of Islam that are misogynist, that are sexist, that are patriarchal, and that seek to oppress women and reduce their humanity. This too is an experience of Islam that many of us have had, and I have in my South African Muslim community. So the fact that religious knowledge and its production in a variety of traditions until the present has remained the preserve of men is, of course, part of the problem. And this is changing. And, you know, of course, we've always had Muslim women educated, brilliant Muslim women scholars in the tradition, but many of us have had that the access to this knowledge has been relatively rendered invisible. And so the work that we're doing now is to render this more visible. So Islam, in its historical and contemporary manifestation, has the whole gamut of gendered positions that have ranged, and this is prior to colonialism, from patriarchal to egalitarian and everything in between. And the recognition that women might experience both of these contesting tendencies is important for us each to acknowledge in the desire for an honest engagement and in the desire for a genuine quest for justice. This is related to another crucial dimension, of course, that notions of culture, tradition, and religion and their relationship to gender is dynamic and fluid. Human beings are simultaneously shaped by religion as much as we are the shapers of religion. This is a simple but curiously persistent assumption that religion, including Islam, is fixed, handed down, and determined. It's almost like a baton that you're going to a race and somebody just hands you this and you run with it, right? And that believers just follow this. And this is, we should, you know, any scholar of Islam and most people know that this is sociologically and historically inaccurate, right? Religion is not only transmitted to people, but also in the process of becoming through the lives, the ideas, the contributions, the innovations, the reformulations, the rejections, and the embrace of its believers in history. And to quote Shahab Ahmed, Islam is the process of continuous and various productions of meaning by Muslims. And I say this, and one of my critiques of Shahab Ahmed's brilliant book is that he seems to completely ignore all of the voices. He does this magnificent coverage of 500 years of Muslim tradition with a relatively kind of zero level of engagement with Muslim women and gender. And so, you know, we all have our limitations, some more than the others. So much of Islamic feminism is not simply an engagement with the riches of the past, but also, for me, a full location in the present, attentive to our times, our needs, our problems, and our possibilities, that we are attentive to the ayat on our particular social horizon when we engage with what it means to be Muslim and when we engage with justice, spirituality, and ethics. And so Islamic feminists have done this work that they do. And have engaged this kinds of broader, well, let me just go back one. So in engaging with tradition and with scholarship, there's a number of epistemological questions that Islamic feminists engage, given the multiple and sometimes contrary economies of gender we engage with both in the past and the present. And so some of these critical questions that might seem simple, but we do need to constantly revisit, is how to understand the nature of tradition, right? What analytical methods are illuminating when engaging Muslim tradition? What core resources within tradition need to be meaningfully foregrounded? How to critically engage contemporary forms of religious authority, and how to develop inclusive and emancipatory horizons of imagination. And so in a kind of attending to these kinds of epistemological questions, Islamic feminists have developed a number of different methodological tools, or their broader methodological approaches are one of three, I would argue. On the one hand, and in some of my work, I have a piece called, it's got Barzakh somewhere in the I can't remember the exact name, but it's got Barzakh somewhere in the title. But one of the ways in which I've described the work that we do is through a gardening metaphor. I've said that Islamic feminists do two things. We do weeding and seeding, right? On the one hand, when we do weeds, we remove, or we're looking for, with this very critical eye, or what has been called by some theorists a hermeneutic of suspicion, is that we look at both the tradition in the past and our lives currently, and we do a critique and a deconstruction of sexism, of patriarchy, and of all forms of kind of gendered injustice. And this work is like pulling out the weeds from the garden. What is it that sucks out the life from the garden that is our tradition and our lives? And we see patriarchy as one of those traditions that suck out the life-giving force of the tradition. And so this critique or this weeding or removing of the weeds is what Islamic feminists do when they do a very critical reading of the tradition. And then there are two more constructive kinds of work that Islamic feminists do. And for me, that first critique, we all need to do that. We need to do that so that we're clearing the garden. But the real work is to plant seeds. The real work is to focus on the beautiful plants that are nurturing already present, the old oak tree in our tradition, all the various kinds of flowers and trees and plants of possibility that exist. And so these two kinds of different modalities, methodologies that I focus on, one is what I would term retrievals or recovery, and here it's about going deep within the Muslim tradition and retrieving stories, retrieving aspects, retrieving strong traditions of gender justice, of human dignity, of equality, of contestations of gender that have gone down within Muslim history and that are often silenced. And so that idea of retrieving is to render visible what is in the tradition, but has been rendered invisible by the patriarchy or by those who are in authority. And then thirdly, the whole work of reconstruction or reimagining, or what is called a hermeneutics of reconstruction, which is both the seeding and the feeding within tradition. And so those are effectively the three kinds of methodological approaches that Islamic feminists have used in a variety of different spaces. And so what I would like to do today in that kind of third modality, I also want to say up front, and I want to follow on the very beautiful kind of metaphors that were used both by Betül and by Shuruq. I love the idea of Islamic feminism being both rooted and restless. I'm going to borrow that, Betül. I love the idea of embracing a restlessness, but also embracing our rootedness. And, the idea of this pluriverse, this kind of language that's now come into vogue at universities and academic spaces, the idea of decoloniality. I want to claim that actually, before it became fashionable to use the language of decoloniality, Islamic feminists have been contributing to a broader decolonial archive by long retrieving genealogies of egalitarianism from within Muslim tradition, while engaging in what the brilliant Indian scholar Chandra Mahantri decades ago called horizontal comradeship, with a number of other feminist discourses. This involved learning and sharing of analytical tools and solidarities between groups of women that were committed to gender justice, without the assumption of a universal feminist voice or a singular woman's experience. So these conversations have been part of Islamic feminism from the get-go. And so it's lovely to see decolonial scholarship coming to our table, is how I'd like to claim it. So I'd like to suggest that when Islamic feminists authorize, authenticate, or recuperate, we do so in complex and non-binary ways. And so to this end, in terms of reimagining, one of the works that so this paper of mine, my presentation today, is drawing on a work that I published in 2023, which is called Fidelities, Feminisms, Friendships, Feminisms and Fidelities, Theorizing Islamic Feminism. And so I offer here the idea of Islamic feminism as a friendship within tradition. That is a project of friendship suffused with intimate, existential, and ethical relationships based on mutual care and concern. Now, locating it within tradition kind of really claims the nuanced spaces of belonging and participation as we wrestle with reconstituting the very terms of belonging in the face of patriarchal legacies and reimagining the nature of tradition through constructive theological work. Okay, so in proposing this idea of a radical critical fidelity, what do I mean by this? I would like to suggest that this idea of a radical critical fidelity, or what I call this friendship within tradition, characterized by a radical love and commitment to the tradition, a devotion to the tradition, a real sense of the possibilities and the inspirations, and a deep love for these, and simultaneously a radical and candid critique of hierarchy, of patriarchy. And so such a radical politics needs also a clear recognition that all of our ideas of justice are evolving and change over time. And I think this is an important thing for us to recognize. No Muslim would say that injustice is okay. Justice has always been the imperative of Muslims from the time of the Prophet ﷺ to the present period. However, conceptions of justice have really changed from the 6th century, where ideas of slavery were part of a Muslim imagination, to the 21st century, where slavery no longer is considered part of any justice making. And so we need to recognize this dynamism of the fact that justice itself is both a universal, but also the particularity of what justice means changes over time. And also, we need to be alert here and now to how certain articulations of justice are things that we might be comfortable to ignore, but we need to not ignore it. So I think that's something that we need to be also rendering front and center. And so I would like to describe this radical fidelity as Islamic feminist modes of religious becoming through inclusive, compassionate, critical, justice-based, imaginative, and courageous ways of being. So, let's see. Now, what I'm going to present then is this articulation, and I'm going to draw very constructively. It's essentially an Islamic feminist theological project, this work that I'm currently busy with, which is to draw on the notion of walaya within tasawwuf and to think about what that might look like in the context of Islamic feminism. So from the get-go, I want to kind of be very clear. I want to say at the outset that while I draw on Sufism in creative and constructive ways, I've explicitly in other work already clearly argued that Sufism is not the exclusive realm of all things that are peaceful, gender-sensitive, or egalitarian in Islam. Sufism does not represent simply the good Muslims, as some of the Western media would like to represent us. Sufism in its historical and current form presents us with a full spectrum of gendered norms, ranging from patriarchal Sufi approaches on the one hand to gender-inclusive approaches on the other. And I really, one of the wonderful things about this conference is I know those of you that are scholars know that there's all this new reading that comes out. And Faiza and Shobana, who are here, colleagues, have this wonderful volume that came out last year, at the end of last year, and I had no time except on the plane to read it when I came here. So I want to thank this conference for creating the space to do that. And they use this lovely idea of engaging the multiplicity of Sufi voices as Sufi heterogeneity, in the same way that Shuruq says there is no one Sufi narrative. I really like that the way you have encapsulated that in that term. And I think we need to embrace that because it allows us to deal with complexity and hold complexity and not flatten the debates into kind of political posturing. So, I'm saying that up front. I'm assuming that people here, my engagement with Sufism is not about essentializing it, but rather drawing on central narratives within it to enable egalitarian imaginaries. So, walaya. Walaya has a strong currency, and I want to, as a verbal noun in Arabic, it's a term that incorporates a range of complex meanings surrounding friendship, which includes notions of proximity, love, loyalty, assistance, mutuality, protection, and power. So drawing on the Quranic conceptions of God through the name Al-Wali, the divine friend, and through identifying exemplary human beings as awliya, the friends of God, notions of walaya have a powerful circulation in a traditional Muslim worldview. Now, I want to also point out, from pre-modern legal scholars, for example, drawing on the same root, elaborated on dimensions of protection from within a patriarchal worldview to create the juristic concept of wilaya, male guardianship over women. And Muslim feminists have illustrated how this juristic concept has enabled inequitable hierarchical forms of male authority and restricted female capacity in Islamic law. I am, however, consciously reclaiming the ground of this term, drawing on Sufi works for my project. Within Sufism, the term walaya has used to signify spiritually refined human beings whose work of inner cultivation has resulted in a loving proximity to God. These awliya have attained the ideal, ultimate human subjectivity in spiritual terms. Sufis have elaborate mappings of walaya with the 11th century Hujwiri's sweeping assertion that the foundation of Sufism and all knowledge of God rests on walaya. By the way, just slow me down when I talk too fast. I am a fast talker, and especially if I'm in a context where English is not a first language. Just do this, and I will respond, promise. So for the 13th century Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi, walaya is primarily differentiated by experiential knowledge, or ma'rifah, of those who have attained deep intimacy with God. And as such, the goal of human life, or the ideal human subjectivity for a believer, is to aspire to this kind of aspirational friendship with God. Walaya then represents a central interaction around which Sufi concepts of personhood and theology revolve. Self-formation, and I think this is really something quite simple, but I think really profound. Cultivation of self, tazkiyah, or self-formation, that attains to the deepest knowledge in spiritual terms, is described as a reciprocal relationship between between the divine and the human, as a friendship. And this is one of the central ideas that I want to use for the feminist project. A friendship with God founded on love and intimacy is an aspirational, ideal relationship with God. It is an archetypal model for relationship to al-haq, and pursuing this relationship assists the believer to attain the ultimate ends of Islam. Spiritual refinement is contingent on forms of friendship, and I would like to submit that the cultivation of spiritually informed friendships in the social world oh, sorry, I've lost my paper. Nourishes friendships with the divine friend while allowing us to give form to the social reality. This theological lens enables us to recognize that our images of the divine, our images of the divine in ways that might reconfigure the God-human relationship. Now, walaya in tasawwuf is used, of course, to refer to a very specific form of spiritual attainment and the range of relationships formed by a relatively rare group of people who have realized this high station, right? And it's been used to describe those who, through this attainment of a friendship with God, play a unique cosmological and social role and become the purveyors of blessings and rahmah and karama and miracles. More especially within Sufism, the awliya are those rare individuals whose modes of being have enabled them to attain forms of knowledge such that they are best able to serve other human beings in benevolent ways and are empowering for their communities. And I'd like to submit that the internal state of an accomplished friend of God is such that she is able to see with two eyes: the eyes of distinctiveness, recognizing human diversity in all of its complexity, and the varying states of consciousness, ranging from the lowest to the highest, while simultaneously apprehending the unitive, exalted divine spirit within each human life. Drawing on Sufism, one could state that a wali, a friend of God, is the waladul waqt, is the child of the moment, in a state of living presence, apprehending and receptive to the divine, enabling the person to respond with insight and discernment to the immediate needs of those around her. And as such, service to God seamlessly translates into service to other human beings and all of creation. So a friend of God, thus, serves the needs of her community at multiple levels, and this has been, of course, evident from the work of Sufi orders around the world that have demonstrated through material and social support that are responsive to the immediate needs of their community. We also have a history of Sufi leaders who have been part of anti-colonial movements, right? So there's been a way in which Tasawwuf and Sufi leaders have been really attentive to the political. This kind of, binary of a quieter Sufi movement that, kind of withdraws into the interior world is not actually historically accurate. And I would argue not even theologically appropriate. So here it's critical to note that spiritual refinement, I would argue, is fundamentally connected to the collective good. Now, there is undoubtedly a spiritual hierarchy embedded in notions of walaya as signifying the highest form of refinement. The more refined a person becomes, the more intimate is your friendship with God, and thus the more exalted is the spiritual station. Within Sufi tradition, the relationship between a spiritual teacher and his or her student is contingent on a hierarchy of power. Now, let me say something rather guardedly and rather reservedly, is that not all forms of hierarchy need to be damaging or detrimental. Some forms of hierarchy might in fact be necessary and beneficial. In much of social life and learning, people occupy varied positions of knowledge, of skill, of capacity, serving the diverse needs of society. From another perspective, all pedagogical relationships, all teaching relationships are invariably hierarchical, since the teacher has greater skills or knowledge than her student, and in the process of education, she enables the growth and the empowerment of the student in that particular sphere. So this necessary dynamic of power wielded by skilled or learned people in various sectors of a society has been described in social theory as a form of competent authority. And these forms of hierarchy are not fundamentally problematic insofar as they do not result in abuse, injustice, or exploitation. And more especially, hierarchies in these relationships of learning are not meant to be static nor fixed. Even in cases where the teacher is a competent authority, it is necessary to recognize that a pedagogical relationship also always results in the transformation of a teacher through growth in that teaching relationship. Any of us that are professors at universities immediately know that the time that you learn best is when you're teaching something, right? And you learn not only from the fact that you have to make things accessible, but from the questions, the insights, and the comments of your students. And so it's genuinely a way in which one is learning constantly. This is especially the case within Sufism, where spiritual teachers and their students are not in stagnant relationships, nor is anyone's internal state unchanging. Or if it is unchanging, we have a problem, right? The Sufi Sheikh-Murid or Sheikha-Murid relationship is premised on an assumption of power that is invested in a trustworthy teacher who has achieved some success in purifying the lower self, and serves as an enlightened mirror of virtue to guide his or her students, reflecting a generative and a constructive use of power. The hierarchical teaching relationship is thus meant to enable optimal learning of the student from a teacher who embodies higher forms of knowledge, but who also is in a state of internal growth and transformation. Invariably, there are ebbs and flows in power contingent on the changing positions and relationships that people inhabit, as when a student becomes a teacher, or the ways that a teacher, through the relationship, is also deepening his or her insight. Nevertheless, these power differentials have been mismanaged and even abused by the powerful. And Sufis have not been immune. In fact, some of my writings here have really come out of the abuses within Sufi tariqas. And so this work has been an attempt to engage what power and those abuses might look like. And they happen, I think they happen all over the world, because this is the nature of the human condition. But it does seem to me that in the West, particularly where Sufi tariqas are becoming quite powerful, there's a way in which one needs to be thinking quite carefully about how to manage some of these abuses. In more benign cases, teachers, to the best of their own understandings and with sincerity, provide guidance that is sometimes not appropriate to a given context. Even the most developed spiritual teachers are fallible. They are socially conditioned people with individual temperaments. Dimensions of selfhood do not simply disappear in the light of spiritual refinement. While accomplished, receptive teachers might overcome very specific limitations, there are invariably instances in which they will be unable to do so. This is simply the nature of the human condition. And indeed, I would argue that it's a mysterious blessing, because it paradoxically demands the cultivation of internal discernment in this relationship for both the teacher and the student. However, more problematic are fraudulent or malevolent spiritual teachers that manipulate their followers and abuse positions of trust. Given the prioritization of the inner state and sometimes the opaque nature of power within Sufism, it's sometimes more vulnerable to ethical manipulation. A charismatic teacher can justify his or her misconduct, claiming that there's some esoteric inner wisdom at work. Here, it's necessary to recognize the full potential for abuse that don't have the necessary checks and balances. The challenge in the context of Sufism is that it's not uncommon for a teacher that has diagnosed, it is not uncommon that a teacher diagnosing an inner imbalance might ask the murid to do something that makes you uncomfortable. And here, the compliance with your teacher's instruction is important for your own transformation. So discomfort or frustration is not itself a reason to reject your sheikh or sheikha's instruction. And here is where it gets tricky, right? It's challenging to navigate this ethical terrain since a student in the process of tazkiyah and self-formation needs to now make a call of whether on the one hand, this specific teaching by her teacher that's making her uncomfortable is in truth based on some wisdom that this teacher has, and that the agitation she's experiencing is due to the kind of nafs internal limitation. And in this case, you need to overcome your discomfort and to be able to receive the teacher's instruction. On the other hand, there may be a substantive spiritual and ethical reason that you are in fact experiencing discomfort. And in this case, you need to attend to that fitri discomfort, right? Because in that case, there might be some flaw or problem with the teacher's advice due to either to a sincere but a limited perception on the part of the teacher or a malevolent intent. Thus, there's a delicate balance between deferring to the wisdom of a teacher who can be trusted to safely enable one's growth as a student and being attentive to your own inner compass when a teacher's instruction brings discomfort. And of course, it's much easier to resist some teaching from your teacher that fundamentally violates your dignity, especially if you don't have an enduring relationship of trust with a teacher. However, this is very seldom how this case unfolds. Most students stick with a teacher who has proven to be helpful, supportive, and effective in their lives over a period of time. And it becomes then more difficult to resist an instruction if the teacher has been an integral part of your growth and your trajectory over the long haul and has therefore earned your trust. In these cases, a student might more easily override his or her own internal dissonance and adhere to a misguided teaching or even an exploitative instruction that might ultimately be damaging for the self or others. In order to encourage students to retain inner vigilance and agency, it's really important for us to rethink sheikh or sheikha-murida relationships. Recognizing the power differentials between students and teachers while reformulating this relationship as a friendship might open up a third space in imagining healthier sheikh-murid relationships. Friendship as a form of relationality can promote an engaged conversation, questioning, probing, reflection, accountability, and transparency as important modes of engagement, rather than unquestioning obedience to a sheikh. Friendship potentially offers a more horizontal, dialogical dimension that might nurture the subtle but vital equilibrium needed between refining love and deference and healthy autonomous judgment. This might be one way to deal with the potential danger of esoteric authority, where wisdom is sometimes opaquely cloaked in the realms of interiority, making ethical accountability and transparency more difficult. I know that I'm running a bit over time, so I'm going to skip all of this. It's also important for us to recognize that spiritual friendships are always situated in the real world of systemic inequalities and vigilance. Friendship is not a safe haven from other kinds of power. It's no magic circle of protection from race, from gender, from class, from nationality. And actually, here I was really very impressed with the editorial that was part of that special volume that Faiza and Shobana and Francisco did, which was really to locate Sufism in, historically and temporally, but to really say that these things don't happen outside of national context and broader geopolitical context. So we also always need to be thinking about these kinds of conceptualizations in the way in which it operates in the here and the now and in different spaces and times. And so I think that It's vital to recognize that spiritual friendships are always situated in these real worlds of systemic inequalities, and part of it is to foster friendships based on mutuality that demand an internal vigilance against structures of sexism, of racism, of homophobia, amongst others that position individuals and groups in very different ways. Truly discerning friends need to traverse the inner and outer complexities of power to arrive at forms of relationality that are mutually vivifying and recuperative. A Sufi-inspired feminist approach must thus demand that we reconfigure our paradigms of value, which enable us to call out all damaging forms of social hierarchy, including patriarchal approaches within Sufi tariqas and Muslim communities more broadly, as well as all other structural inequalities that one encounters in a society. Indeed, positing friendship as a way of imagining forms of relationality that reconfigure power moves us away from static hierarchies and encourages us towards dynamism, mutuality, accountability, and love. And there are productive and fertile spaces within Islamic feminism to think of friendship in encompassing ways that includes friendship with tradition, friendship with current and past spiritual teachers, friendship with peers and cohorts, friendship between men and women, friendship as a mode of relationship to the self. One of the things that I always tell young women is that please be as kind to yourself as you are to your friends. So friendship with the self is a very important spiritual mode, actually. Friendship with our Rasul and all the Anbiya, all the prophets, and indeed, and always, ultimately, a friendship with the divine friend. Allah is indeed the protecting friends of those who have faith. Allahu waliyul ladhi amanu yukhrijuhum min ath-thulumati ila an-nur. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Professor Shaikh, for a deeply resonant and intellectually generous presentation. Well, in the light with the ethos of the presentation, let us open up this session into a conversation in a way to engage one another dialogically rather than a standard Q&A session. So if you have any comments, reflections, or dialogical questions, I would like to begin with you all. Or if not, I will begin. So the floor is yours.